on behalf of IFC. I am joined in the room by my colleague Anjali, who I'm sure most of you know well. And there are other colleagues connected on the VC from our financial markets team. I don't think this audience needs an introduction why we are doing this seminar, because taxonomy, having consistent and clear standards, clear guidelines is very important for opening up the climate finance market. And we are really thankful to IBA for being a trusted and a long-term partner to us in this important exercise. I welcome Mr. Gopal and Mr. Chandrasekhar to this seminar. I also want to say, yeah, hello.
Yeah, Mr. Shalab, our chairman of this ESG committee of IBA, Shri S. Raman has also joined. He is CMD of SIDBI also.
Okay, that's great. That's great to know. Welcome, welcome. I would also like to thank the speakers for today from SBFN, from AFD, and from UNEP. I see Louisa, I see Laura. I'm not sure Laurent has joined or not, but we're expecting Laurent to also join. Just note that, Anjali. Over the next 2 hours, we will be giving an overview of you will all be getting an overview of the global taxonomy approaches, along with case studies from Sri Lanka, South Africa, EU, Latin America, amongst other countries. Today's session will also provide insights from the recent taxonomy toolkit developed by SPFN and facilitated by the IFC Secretariat. I think, as all of you know, one of the key gaps in the finance today is having consistent and clear standards and definition, and this is an attempt to further that agenda. As India is the largest market for IFC on the investment side, and we have been doing business in India for a very long time. In fact, on the renewable energy side, we started investing in solar projects way before the market started investing in that. So, and climate is a central piece of our strategy for IFC in India, globally also, and in India also. The World Bank Group has set very ambitious standards for IFC and for everyone else. 100% of our investments starting from 2024-25 have to be Paris aligned. So, and therefore we want to create a lot of partnerships with the financial institutions in domestic markets, and also work on various financial products and instruments for enhancing the sustainable finance market here. So I won't be taking too long here. I think we have a very exciting agenda in front of us. We have recently done similar seminars with IBA, which were well received. We're also working with the RBI on the taxonomy side, on the sustainable, we were part of the Sustainable Finance Task Force, and so on. One thing where we would like to help also is on the real sector side. IFC, this is a group of only financial institutions, but IFC has a large program on infrastructure, on manufacturing, on VC and private equity funds, on healthcare, education, agri-tech, and so on. And climate is a theme which cuts across all the sectors here, and not just mitigation, but also adaptation and resilience. And lastly, we would like to thank the colleagues from EU, because they have been donors for us through their Access partnership. And because of them, this workshop is possible. So really thank you for that. With that, let me pass it on to Anjali, who will be moderating the session. Thanks.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Shalab, for your opening remark. It's great to be here with all of you again. Last time we spoke and met was in May, when we did a session on climate risk for the ESG committee and the working group of IBA. And in between, we did our TCFD training, and today we are delivering this workshop on taxonomy. After Shalab, I would now request the Deputy Chief Executive of IBA, Mr. Gopal Bhagat, to please share his views and address all the participants.
Thank you, Anjali, and thanks, Mr. Shalab Tandon also. At the outset, I extend warm welcome on behalf of IBA to all the participants, and a special welcome to Chairman of ESG Committee of IBA, Shri S. Raman, CMD of SIDBI. Thank you very much, sir. Joining, we are really thrilled now to have you with us in this meeting. Your presence will add further grace to this. Today, the audience for this webinar is our working group on taxonomy. We have been arranging under the leadership of Raman Saab various webinars, meetings for the skill development, for capacity building of the banking industry in the country. So this is one big step ahead, because on taxonomy we have been till now looking at it from the challenges, various challenges which we have in our country as far as ESG steps are concerned. So I'm very hopeful after today's webinar we will have some definitive direction based on the experience globally which IFC has got. I will request Raman Saab for his initial address. Sir, would you like to address the gathering, and then we can go ahead with the webinar? I think some technology issue with him. So over to you, Anjali. We can go ahead with the webinar.
Thank you, Mr. Bhagat, and thank you for sharing your remarks with us. I'll quickly actually start the seminar and we'll jump into our first presentation, which is by Louise Gardiner. She is our working group coordinator with the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, SBFN. As most of you would know, IFC is the secretariat for SBFN, and SBFN is a platform for knowledge sharing and capacity building on sustainable finance, financial sector regulators and industry associations across emerging markets. And SBFN also closely works. Yes, Mr. Raman, we can hear you now. Sorry, I think Mr. Raman got disconnected. Mr. Raman, can you hear us?
We are able to hear you. Please go ahead.
Mr. Raman sir was trying to say something, but he got disconnected.
I think we can go ahead. You will once he joins.
Sure, Mr. Bhagat. Sure, Mr. Bhagat. With that, I'll hand over to Louise to take us through her presentation. Over to you, Louise. Louise, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
If you'll just give me a moment, I'm trying to reshare my screen and make sure I don't mess it up. All right, is that coming through clearly?
Yes, Louise.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for the invitation to present today. As Anjali said, I am the SBFN coordinator for Africa and for the working group on sustainable finance instruments. And in that context, we have done some research to support members on taxonomies, and I'm very pleased to share with you today draft excerpts from that toolkit, which is currently under development. I'll also briefly tell you a little bit about the SBFN, which is facilitated by IFC. And just to acknowledge that IBA has been a member of SBFN since 2016, so we're very pleased to be supporting you in this important work. So SBFN, very briefly, the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, we were launched in 2012 with 10 founding countries, initially called the Sustainable Banking Network. We were focusing on supporting banking regulators and banking associations to develop the enabling frameworks for sustainable finance. We only focus on emerging markets. And then 2 years ago, at the direction of our members, we were told we need to expand it to Sustainable Banking and Finance Network to include capital markets, other parts of the financial sector. And I think that relates very much to topics like taxonomy, where we're seeing these policy instruments are cross-cutting and very useful tools. So what's really important to note is that SBFN focuses on the full spectrum of sustainable finance. So we look at both the policies to enable risk management of environmental, social governance risks, as well as increased capital flows. to activities with sustainability benefits. This is what our members have said is important to balance both the risk and the opportunity. To date, 33 countries in the network have launched over 200 policy documents. We now have 80 member institutions from 63 countries. So we're seeing rapid uptake of sustainable finance frameworks. This just gives you a sense of the scope of our membership across all parts of emerging markets. We're also seeing more regional collaboration between regulators and industry associations. So we actually, again, this is, I think we'll hear from the UN colleagues about the regional initiative on taxonomy in Latin America, which is a great example of regional collaboration on sustainable finance. But as I mentioned, our focus is really looking at how do you combine ESG risk management with directing capital flows to activities that have environmental and social benefits. And taxonomies really are one of the key ways to do that. In the last few years, we've seen a rapid increase in the number of countries globally, as well as in emerging markets, that are adopting national or regional sustainable finance taxonomies. And taxonomies are simply a list of definitions of the types of activities and projects and entities that can be called green or sustainable or socially inclusive. And they emerged because regulators were developing sustainable finance roadmaps or guidelines for the banking sector or other parts of the financial sector. For instance, in South Africa, our pension funds are required to incorporate ESG considerations into their investment strategies. They're the only part of the financial sector that's regulated that way. So whichever part of the financial sector you regulate, if you require allocations to green or you require environmental and social risk management, you may want to consider bringing in a list of eligible activities that actually meet those criteria. So that's what's happened in these 11 countries: Bangladesh, Brazil, China, Colombia, Georgia, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Mongolia, South Africa, and Sri Lanka. And we're trying to keep up because there are more countries issuing taxonomies. And obviously countries like Australia, the UK, and then the EU, the European Union, have also brought in taxonomies. One of the other key regional initiatives that we have followed is the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, so the ASEAN Regional Taxonomy, which is a high-level taxonomy that with principles that is meant to be used by the member countries of ASEAN to develop their taxonomies so that there can be alignment. So we compared the taxonomies based on entities in charge, what the overarching goals and sources are, how it fits within the hierarchy of sustainable finance frameworks, what types of activities are included, which sectors, which underlying activities in those sectors, the scope of sustainability topics. Is it just green, or is it green, social, sustainability? Does it align with the SDGs? How do you define alignment? What are the rules or principles for actually how activities are aligned? What are the mechanisms to ensure holistic impact? So making sure that risks are managed so that you don't have a green project which also has a negative social impact, because that would be inconsistent with sustainability. Then things like the process for creating and revising the taxonomy over time. These are usually living documents that need to be constantly updated. And how will they be applied to different types of sustainable finance? So will it be for loans, for bonds, for equities, for private equity? Where does it apply? For insurance, Colombia, for instance, applies theirs to insurance. And given that we have all these various taxonomies, how do they interact with each other? How do we allow them to be interoperable or recognized by other jurisdictions? And then finally, how do you enforce the taxonomy? Do you enforce the taxonomy? Is it voluntary or is it mandated within other guidelines? And then can it be used for prudential assessment? So yes, it's for capital flows, but can it also be used to assess risk in the market? So I'll give you now a bit of a brief introduction to taxonomies as we're seeing this trend take form. So the reason we have someone crossing a river by stepping on the stones is it's taken from the Chinese quote that, you know, when you're exploring new terrain, you're doing new things, you cross the river by feeling the stones. And so taxonomies are a new development for most countries, and we are seeing the first editions of these taxonomies in most cases and seeing how they're implemented. Only a few countries have done multiple revisions. China and Indonesia are examples of countries that are now in their second or third iteration of taxonomies. So it takes a while to learn what needs to be in these taxonomies and what they need to do. This is the definition from the International Capital Market Association. A taxonomy is a classification system identifying activities, assets, and/or project categories that deliver on key climate, green, social, or sustainable objectives with a reference to identified thresholds and/or targets. So this sums up the solution that's been developed to address something we're all familiar with, which is greenwashing. So the fears or accusations that have emerged in recent years that some of the green instruments that have been issued might not have met rigorous green credentials or technical criteria or risk management. So how do you make sure that what you're calling green is actually green and that everybody agrees with you? The only thing I would add to this definition is that we've seen most taxonomies focus mainly on assets and activities and projects, but they can also be used for an entity like a company to report on their alignment across their operations. And we're seeing this in places like the European Union, where there is strong disclosure requirements coming in, and corporations are reporting on their alignment, and it's making them more attractive to investors. So international taxonomies, this is an important place to start, because before we saw national taxonomies being developed, there were actually some international initiatives that issuers could use, for instance, for green bond issuance. So in the green bond issuance space, you've got the green bond principles developed by the International Capital Markets Association. And they've got a set of 4 principles for developing, preparing, and issuing a green bond. In addition, they give a list of eligible activities, and this is their list. It's a short list. They define the general green sector, like renewable energy or energy efficiency, and then they give a description of what fits under that particular category. But they don't go into a lot of detail in terms of technical criteria. Then you have the climate bonds initiative, their taxonomy under their climate bond certification. So they've got a standard for how bonds would be certified. And in order to make that standard work and be verifiable, they developed a taxonomy where they identified the technical criteria for specific sectors and activities. So you'd have general sector and then subsector. And you're looking at things like climate change mitigation activities under, for instance, transport, ICT, manufacturing, and then specific activities in those areas with their key technical criteria. You also have something called the Common Principles for Climate Mitigation and Finance Tracking. And this is used by the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank Group. So for our investments, they at a minimum need to meet these requirements. The MDB Common Principles, they have a set of eligibility principles. So for instance, the activities must have negative or very low emissions. And I think you just heard that IFC has very strong ambitions for climate finance. So it must have negative or near zero net GHG emissions. There are considerations for transition. So in cases where there isn't a technologically or economically feasible, very low emission alternatives, then other activities can be considered, but then they must still comply with certain performance criteria. Then you have enabling activities, which are necessary for developing or implementing other eligible climate mitigation activities. And the sectors that are covered by the MDB common principles are energy, mining and metal, manufacturing, agriculture, water, solid waste management, transport, buildings, ICT, and then also research, development and innovation, and cross-sectoral activities. Now, as I read out that list of sectors, you'll start to see some commonalities in the types of sectors that are covered by taxonomies. So why would a country develop their own taxonomy if you already have international taxonomies available? Well, yes, we're trying to align with international goals. For instance, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which requires mitigation and adaptation, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are ambitious global level aspirations. But then they need to be translated to regional and national level. So what makes sense at the regional and national level? At the regional level, we have the European Union taxonomy, which we'll hear about later, and the ASEAN taxonomy. And in those cases, there is some applicability that needs to be identified at national level. So once you get to national level, you're looking at national goals and sustainability targets, which are aligned with, for instance, global ambitions. You've also got national regulations that come into play and different standards of performance. So, for instance, in South Africa, the ambitions for green building certification is not going to be as strong as in the European Union. Some of our green buildings will meet the requirements of the European Union, but if we only have the European Union definition, we might restrict the growth of the green bond market in South Africa. We also might have areas that we want to develop activities that aren't a priority for the European Union. South Africa is a very mining intensive country. So if the mining sector needs to be considered in terms of the green economy transition. So how do we incorporate them? How do we bring in principles of just transition, making sure that people aren't economically and socially impacted negatively? So these are national level considerations that come into play. And that's the reason why you might want to have a national level taxonomy. So taxonomies have emerged from different directions. They've come from central banks, they've come from banking associations, ministries of finance, ministries of environment, and they've been designed for multiple purposes, for a range of uses. So for central banks, they're looking to provide guidance to the banking sector on how to align their lending portfolio, mostly. In the capital market space, you might want guidance on use of proceeds for green bond issuance. In the pension fund sector in South Africa, you might want guidance for how do pension funds align with sustainable finance. So there's a range of uses, different financial products, but it can be a very key component of the country's sustainable finance framework. And one of the key findings from our research is how important it is to have a governance of sustainable finance at a national level. So it's fine for initially maybe the central bank to start or the capital markets regulator to start, but ultimately these systems start to intersect, and it's really good to have an overarching governance framework for sustainable finance in a country supported by the banking association. The banking associations play a critical role to as part of the consultation as well as implementation for these systems. Taxonomies then provide the common understanding and language of what is green. And most of the time we see the reason to develop a taxonomy is there's confusion in the market and people say, well, what do you mean by green, right? Which activities, which sectors, what are you trying to promote? As a policymaker, what are you trying to achieve? And it can really help with other types of sustainable finance policy interventions. As we mentioned, prudential supervision, as well as market conduct. So this summarizes some of what I've covered in the previous slide. But you can see here that the use cases cut across capital markets, banking, private equity and SMEs, asset owners and managers. And I mentioned private equity and SMEs because one of the key considerations is to make sure that taxonomies really are accessible to SMEs and not simply designed for big projects in the country, like infrastructure. So we've seen some countries have been particularly good, like Mongolia has been quite good at making sure that there are categories that relate to households and SMEs. So there's also a divergence in the entities that are in charge of taxonomy development. I think I mentioned this. So for instance, in Bangladesh, the central bank is involved, and therefore the taxonomy focuses on financial institutions and is enforced more strictly. So the banks must disclose their lending according to the taxonomy. The instrument also encompasses both green and sustainable finance. In Brazil, it's a voluntary approach for the time being, although I think Brazil is now, the central bank is looking to develop a taxonomy. The green taxonomy was initially developed by the Banking Association, FEBRABAN, and does not claim to be the official taxonomy for the country. So this impacts the uptake and how it is used. In Colombia, the super regulator, the Financial Superintendency of Colombia, is in charge of the taxonomy along with other key regulators. And they have oversight for banking, pensions, insurance. And so they've added all of those to the scope of the application. But what we've noticed is it's really important to have government involved because these taxonomies should align with national policies and what needs to be achieved. So a comparison across the countries just to see, is this more of a green initiative? Is this more of a social initiative? I think it's very clear that the taxonomies to date, they focus on green activities, as well as in not all countries, but most countries also focus on activities that will enable green, the transition to a green economy. We also have some focus on low carbon transition, a little bit on social criteria for green. So this is not a separate social taxonomy, and it's not the social safeguards. It is specifically that there should be some criteria or benefits, social benefit added to the green. A few countries have a social taxonomy, so Bangladesh, Brazil, Georgia, and Mexico. There's a lot of talk about just transition and how do you facilitate the just transition. This is making sure that the transition to a low carbon economy doesn't have a negative impact on people and communities. But so far, there isn't a taxonomy on that. But there is some work being done in South Africa to think about how to incorporate principles for a just transition. There's some interest in unsustainable activities, having a list, like a gray list or a brown list or a list of activities that needs to be avoided. And then 2 countries have introduced SDG taxonomy, so China and Mongolia, and this is activities that contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. So taxonomies have really evolved in different ways. There's a lot of divergence, convergence, and these 6 elements are what we're seeing emerge as common areas and potentially could be seen as areas for defining interoperability. Because if we all start to use the same approach or similar approaches, or we understand each other's approaches, that makes it easier to understand how different taxonomies compare. So the first principle on the left-hand side, the requirement to make a significant contribution to environmental and social objectives. This is the approach the European Union took. So they identified 6 environmental objectives, and that became the governing purpose of their taxonomy, was to develop activities that can make a significant contribution. So that was the key principle, make a significant contribution. The next element is to have a list of eligible sectors and activities, right? So whether you have the objectives or not, you can then proceed to having a list of the eligible sectors and activities. So you identify, often this is done by assessing which are the dominant activities in a country, and then prioritizing them and starting to develop activities that can be called green. There's also a whitelist option, which doesn't require a significant contribution, but is simply these sectors if you meet that criteria, you're in or out, and that's your whitelist. The next element is technical criteria to ensure high standards of environmental and social performance. There's quite a bit of variability on this one. So some countries have very detailed technical criteria and some countries don't. And some countries have a mix. For instance, Sri Lanka has a mix of some categories are simply, being in that category or activity is sufficient. There are no technical criteria that need to be met. So they've combined a number of things for the Sri Lanka taxonomy. Then you have the principle of do no significant harm or environmental and social safeguards. Do no significant harm is quite a unique principle. It means that if you can't make a significant contribution to one objective of a taxonomy, you mustn't make a negative contribution to the other environmental objectives. It's quite a special principle, and it's something the European Union brought in. And then there's requirements to meet environmental and or social safeguards. So the European Union taxonomy requires social safeguards. The South African taxonomy also adopted that. Sri Lanka has included both the do no significant harm and social safeguards, as South Africa has done. Other countries simply require, for instance, Georgia has required that all the activities must meet environmental and social risk management principles. And then Bangladesh included good governance as part of their safeguards. A next element is the traffic light system. This is something that the ASEAN Association for Southeast Asian Nations has used, and the European Union has also explored using this. If you've got a number of activities in your economy that will be part of the transition to a green economy, but not all of them fit the criteria of green, how do you incorporate them? How do you incentivize or define what could be, if it's not green, could it be orange? Could it be partially aligned? Are there a set of criteria to bring it into alignment over time? And then is there a red category that absolutely can't be included? So that's the traffic light system, and it's been used in different ways, in different places. And then finally, linking it to disclosure. That's the main route to implement taxonomies, is requiring disclosure, either for banks to report on their lending, for issuers of green bonds to explain how the use of proceeds will align with taxonomies, or for instance, in capital markets, having listed companies report on their alignment. So these are the 6 elements or things that get moved around and used in different ways in taxonomies. So they're the things for you to look out for. So what did we find through our benchmarking? And you will get these slides, so I won't spend a lot of time on these comparisons. But there's no one size fits all in terms of taxonomies. So there's a split among taxonomies between using a whitelist of sustainable activities or relying on the concept of substantial contribution. And the substantial contribution is often explained in more detail in the technical criteria, which will tell you whether that activity meets the requirement of substantial contribution. And then performance thresholds and principles-based requirements are universally applied. So that's what we're seeing consistently across the taxonomies. And performance thresholds are implemented mostly with pass lists. So you're either in or you're out. But as we mentioned, there are 2 countries that use a traffic light system, providing a system to evaluate transition activities. So that's Brazil and Indonesia. So Indonesia would have done that using the ASEAN. Actually, we've got Brazil, so ASEAN, Brazil, and Indonesia. Then mechanisms to manage negative outcomes or harm. So as I mentioned, the principle of do no significant harm is used in most taxonomies, either to qualify all activities of the taxonomy or only for transition activities. So it's the concept of, and I'll just say it again because it's quite important, it's not just do no harm. It is, in the case of taxonomies, it actually means that if you make a significant contribution to one objective, you mustn't be harming any of the other objectives that were identified for that taxonomy. So if there are 6 environmental objectives, you must make a contribution to at least 1 and not harm the other 5. But we also have something called minimum social safeguards. The minimum social safeguards are the most common because they go along with green taxonomies. If you had a social taxonomy, you might want minimum environmental safeguards. So the social safeguards include labor, particularly labor practices, labor regulations, the International Labour Organization core labor standards, and human rights. The EU has used the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and South Africa has adopted the same. As I mentioned, only Bangladesh has a reference to corporate governance. Okay. And there's another initiative that also helps you. So from the perspective of banks, this means that if you are planning to be aligned with either a national taxonomy, the EU taxonomy, other taxonomies, you will have to, in addition to tagging parts of your loan portfolio or your green bond issuances that align with the objectives, the impact objectives, you will also need to demonstrate your risk management objectives. And what we wanted to identify as IFC is, do the IFC performance standards and the World Bank Group environmental health guidelines and the Equator Principles, does the risk management that is done under these frameworks, does it meet the criteria of do no significant harm? So a study was published earlier this year in May, and the findings, this was done in partnership with the Equator Principles Association, and the findings are yes, there is strong alignment between the IFC performance standards and the European Union taxonomy and its requirement for do no significant harm. That's at the principle level as well as what that looks like at the activity level. So actually drilling down and seeing how that is applied. So yes, if you have an environmental and social risk management system in your bank that is aligned with the IFC performance standards or with the Equator Principles, you're in a very strong position to demonstrate alignment with taxonomy. But you will need to make sure that these systems, the risk management, are applied at the beginning of projects and monitored throughout. In the case of reporting under the EU taxonomy, that would require annual reporting, and so your systems may need to be strengthened in order to meet that requirement. Applications for sustainable finance, we've seen that all the taxonomies support sustainable banking and investments, so looking at the percentage of your lending portfolio that is green, as well as looking at investments in specific projects. What's interesting about the investments component is that you can even break it down into, if you've got an investment in a number of projects that are linked, you can have a percentage, 30% of those assets might be aligned with the taxonomy, and that's what you would be reporting on. So, and it also then is adjusted according to your percentage of investment. All the taxonomies support green, social, and sustainability bonds based on the use of proceeds model. Newer taxonomies also support sustainability-linked finance. A few address accountability of companies or corporates beyond the financial products they issue. So South Africa and the EU, their taxonomies apply to companies. And for instance, we're seeing listed companies in the EU reporting under the reporting regulations. And the reporting is usually done based on CapEx, OpEx, and revenue. And what's really interesting about that is if you look at OpEx or revenue alignment, that'll give you a sense of what your activities, how aligned they are now. But if you look at CapEx reporting, you'll see how aligned an entity is going to be in the future. And that's very interesting for impact-focused investors and finance providers. The taxonomies to date have been a variety of how they're placed in the sustainable finance ecosystem. Some are component-based taxonomies, which means they fit into a particular standard. So the climate bond certification standard is a good example. So the taxonomy is a component of that standard. Bangladesh is similar because they have the environmental and social risk management guidelines, and that's where they've embedded their taxonomy. As well as in their green bond guidelines, they've embedded the taxonomy there. So it could be a component of a broader framework. Then you have overarching taxonomies that cover everything. So that the EU and South Africa are good examples. So all parts of the financial sector are covered. And then you have product-specific taxonomies that might only relate, for instance, to green bonds or green loans or other instruments. I won't spend too much time on this. The process for creation and revision. Most taxonomies are in their early stages, so that the first edition has been published, but they will need to be updated and expanded over time. So how do we deal with the fact that there are these differences? Taxonomies are in early stages of development and implementation. They've only really been a phenomenon of the last 3 to 5 years. China has been using their catalog much longer. They've been working on this, I think, since 2014, 2015. So they've had a number of iterations and they've learned and they've finally combined. They had different taxonomies for different parts of the financial sector and they've combined them and harmonized them. But for the most part, this is new territory for most people. And the benefits of a diversity of approaches is that we get to learn from different countries' solutions. And markets are very different. Some markets are quite small and they focus on specific sectors. Mongolia, for instance, small market, very focused on specific sectors. And so they've designed a taxonomy that works for them. And then you have larger markets where you need to do more and perhaps have a much more detailed technical criteria. So right now, different countries have different needs, and we're also learning from innovation. But it does create a challenge in that it's difficult to compare or to be really confident as an investor or a bank, what taxonomy do you use and how acceptable is one taxonomy for another jurisdiction. So this is one of the challenges that's being tackled at the global level. At the moment, we're looking at a convergence of principles and good practices that help bring these things together. And there are a lot of commonalities. So the current limitations of taxonomies, they're a work in progress. Not all potential activities have been covered yet. So for instance, if you've got 15 sectors in your country that could be green, but your taxonomy only covers 8, you're missing out on 7 sectors that haven't got definitions. So how do you deal with that? How do you allow the market to still innovate and do green finance? Then diversity of taxonomies and approaches and features. So we've talked quite a bit about that. So there is diversity, there is some convergence, and we're still finding our way in terms of what is essential. Complexity. Most people need time to get used to this new tool. It takes time. Sometimes it takes a year or 2 to really understand, that's how we use taxonomies. I think for banks, it's a bit faster because you have to learn much quicker at a transaction level how to demonstrate alignment. And in your case, the learning journey will be working with assurance providers to provide a statement on your level of alignment, making sure that your systems in your bank are aligned. But it can be complex. It does get simpler with time. And it's a journey. So taxonomies will need to change over time, not just to expand and include more sectors, but also as the climate transition happens, we will need to change technologies, performance thresholds. So these things will need to be updated. This can be quite resource intensive for countries. And what works is to have many stakeholders and constituents involved who can help contribute technical expertise to this journey. So some key questions to have in mind. And I know that India is going into a consultation process on your taxonomy. So what I've done is I've got a slide like this for regulators and one for banks to give you a sense of the kind of questions you need to be asking to ensure that the taxonomy meets your needs. So for a regulator, you need to be asking, does my country need a taxonomy? Is there a requirement, or can I use an international taxonomy instead? What are my objectives, and therefore what type of taxonomy do I need? Which policies am I trying to implement? Who will be using the taxonomy, and what do they need it to do? So because there's so many purposes for a tax or uses for a taxonomy, it can get a bit confusing. If you have a clear purpose up front, it makes it easier to implement. Then how? How can I leverage existing global taxonomies and practices? What process should I follow to design an effective taxonomy? How do I link it to my national objectives, policies? How do I ensure that it meets the needs of international and local investors? And how do I enable and track successful use? So is it actually working? That's a critical thing to monitor. And then if there are obstacles, how do you remove those obstacles to implementation? Like assurance is one of the obstacles. We're seeing that assurance providers are cautious because this is a high stakes exercise. So they're cautious about offering their services in this space. So we need to build capacity and provide guidance. And then the what. What are the essential elements? Which ones do I need to include? What are the other market interventions and policies that are needed to leverage the taxonomy for market development? So if it's just existing in a vacuum, nothing's going to happen. It needs to be linked to something. And what kind of governance structure do I need to put in place to expand and maintain the taxonomy over time? So we have a roadmap. So part of this toolkit is offering a roadmap for regulators as they develop the taxonomy in line with those questions. So I won't go into detail here, but I think these steps have been followed. The lead entity has been identified, research and consultation is happening. So the questions for companies and for banks, actually this is questions for banks, not for companies. I need to correct that title. So why would you as a bank use a taxonomy, and how would you choose which taxonomy you're going to be using? Is it the national taxonomy? Is it the MDB taxonomy? Is it the EU taxonomy? Because those are all your options. And what are you going to be using it for? Are you reporting on loans? Are you issuing green, social, or sustainability bonds? Are you going to use the same taxonomy each time? Is it a regulator requirement? So does the central bank require that you report? In that case, you have no option. You must report on taxonomy alignment. Or is it an investor requirement? So you're issuing a bond and you want to target specific investors. Which taxonomy do they use? Or is it part of your own strategy as a bank? So some entities, some banks have actually developed their own taxonomies in the meantime and use those in conjunction with the national and international taxonomies. Are you reporting on an existing portfolio, for instance, which has a challenge because you may have older projects which didn't follow the same risk management process, but now you want to report on those assets? How are you going to retroactively demonstrate alignment? Or are you going to use it to guide new project development where you have more control and you can apply those principles immediately and ensure very credible disclosure? How are you going to implement? Which teams or staff will be responsible for rolling this out? What systems you need to integrate it into? Will it cover the whole business or just part of it? Do you have the appropriate systems in place to assess and demonstrate alignment? So what are the auditable? It needs to be auditable. So how would you make sure that you can audit the alignment credentials? And does your your environmental and social risk management system meet the expectations for safeguards? What? Does the taxonomy cover the types of sectors and activities that your bank focuses on? So if you're focused on agriculture, but there isn't much of agriculture covered in the national taxonomy, how do you resolve that? Can you engage? Can you engage with the regulator to make sure that the activities that are priorities for you are included? Are the technical criteria appropriate to the market? Is it going to be achievable, or is it going to stifle green lending for your bank? Does it match or complement your existing classification approach? Can you anticipate any contradictions or difficulties in combining them? What data will you need to collect going forward? For instance, carbon emissions, tracking of greenhouse gas emissions is probably one of the biggest challenges. And what are the implications for the existing portfolio versus future investments? How can this guide your strategy? So I'm going to briefly touch on a couple of case studies just to explain how this has been done in different countries. Very briefly on the EU, because I know this will be covered, but it confirms a few of the things that I shared in the previous slides. So what did the EU taxonomy look like? They have the six environmental objectives on the right-hand side, and they have elaborated activities for climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and circular economy. The other sectors still require some activities to be developed. The sectors that they focused on: agriculture, manufacturing, electricity, gas, steam, water, transportation, ICT, and buildings. And then their principles: it was make a substantial contribution, do no significant harm, and meet the minimum safeguards. And the way that they've implemented this is a very, the writing's quite small here, but it's just to give you a sense that there's been a timeline for implementation. And at the bottom, you'll see the reporting requirements for companies versus financial institutions. So as of this year, the companies needed to report taxonomy alignment. Prior to this year, they had to report on eligibility, and we'll touch that in a second. And the reporting by the financial institutions follows a year later, so they can currently report on eligibility, and then they will have to report on taxonomy alignment. So what is the difference between eligible and aligned? An economic activity is eligible if it makes a substantial contribution. So you could look at your portfolio and you could say these activities make a substantial contribution. But to be aligned, you need to meet all the other technical criteria and principles, right? And this is what it looks like when you go into the details. So that's the activity, and it describes the activity. And then it gives you, this is a great example of where the guidance, the EU guidance, actually helps you figure out what the negative contribution or the negative impact might be to the other objectives. So for electricity generation, it might have a negative contribution to climate change adaptation. Therefore, the EU tech guidance requires that a climate risk vulnerability assessment be done, similar to impact on biodiversity. And then the minimum social safeguards, this is what needs to be met, particularly the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, as well as the declaration of the International Labour Organization on the fundamental principles of rights at work. So those are key requirements. So what did that look like in South Africa? So South Africa's Green Finance Taxonomy was published last year in April. It took 22 months to develop. There was extensive stakeholder engagement. It's currently voluntary. It's not linked to any regulations or policies, although the disclosure requirement for listed companies does hint at taxonomy alignment, but doesn't mention the South African taxonomy. It was led by the National Treasury of South Africa, but it had all the other key departments. So the Department of Forestry and Fisheries, Monitoring and Evaluation, Financial Sector Conduct Authority, Prudential Authority within the Reserve Bank, the Stock Exchange, the Banking Association, the Council of Retirement Funds, Association for Savings and Investment, and it had representatives from banks and retirement funds. So this was the working group that developed the taxonomy. And the approach was to take the EU taxonomy and adapt it to the South African context. A big priority for South Africa was to attract international investment. So the reason they wanted to use the EU taxonomy is to make it easier for European investors to invest in South Africa. But the sectors were then, the sector guidance was then adapted to national regulations, and in some cases, like green buildings, using local green building standards. It currently only covers green, but the idea is to expand it over time. It is relevant to the whole financial sector, and it looks at activities as well as entity level disclosure. And it includes the do no significant harm principle and the social safeguards. So why did South Africa develop a taxonomy? It was to enable identification of economic activities that make significant environmental contributions, a tool for change, a common language, and something that aligns with the direction that the economy needs to go into. This is an example of the mapping that was done in order to develop the taxonomy. The consultants undertook a comprehensive mapping of other taxonomies at the time. This was done in 2020, and used this to help guide the working group on how to select the best approach. So very similar to the EU taxonomy. It currently only has activities for climate change mitigation and adaptation, but it does have an additional 4 environmental objectives. It has the 4 principles: significant contribution, technical standards, do no significant harm, and social safeguards. And those are the sectors on the right-hand side. So you see very similar sectors coming up because it was using the EU sectors. And you'll see at the bottom it has enabling activities to support green finance, as well as social resilience activities, education and skills to support the green economy. This gives you a sense of what it looks like. You can see these are the activities that have been mapped, and not all the activities currently have technical criteria. And when you delve into the technical criteria, and this is where it gets very real for banks, I think, because this is the level where you need to operate, is once you've identified the activities that are in your portfolio that could be aligned with the taxonomy, you then have to go through that specific section for that activity very carefully and make sure that you meet the technical criteria that have been set out there, and you don't do significant harm, and that you meet the social safeguards. So this is where your teams, your staff will be operating. And the key thing is, how do you know that you're in or out? You're either aligned or you're not. And the South African taxonomy is still under development, as you can see here, with a view to, there has been some requests to develop a taxonomy for non-compatible activities, for climate transition, and for social and transition, but that's something happening in the future. So Sri Lanka, very briefly, and then we'll open for some questions. So the Sri Lanka Green Finance Taxonomy, this is an interesting example. Data publication was May last year. They took around 1 year to develop their taxonomy, so it was quite efficient. Yet there was stakeholder engagement, and there was a public comment period, which is very important. So sensitizing the market is very crucial, because people wake up a bit slowly and then they go, hang on a second, this is too difficult, or I don't understand it, or I can't apply it. So stakeholder engagement is critical. It's currently also voluntary, although there's consideration for green bond guidelines and green banking guidance. So the intention is to incorporate it into the green bond guidelines and green banking guidance. The lead institution was the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. It forms part of the Sustainable Finance Roadmap for the country. There were 3 rounds of separate group consultations over 7 months with all key aligned ministries, local financial institutions, and third-party service providers. It is the first national green finance taxonomy developed using something called the Common Ground Taxonomy, which was published by the International Platform on Sustainable Finance and looks at the mapping between the EU and the China taxonomy. So that's what's really interesting here, is that mapping, the Common Ground Taxonomy, can be a place to start. And it had a technical expert group that was formed with experts from the Climate Bonds Initiative, China's Tsinghua University, and 2 Sri Lankan local experts. So they formed a technical expert group, which is a common tool for taxonomy development. And as I mentioned, they have a mix of whitelist options, technical criteria, and certifications as proxies. That means that, for instance, they will recognize certain certifications like a green building certification or a manufacturing certification as a proxy for alignment. And it also incorporates, so it links to the Climate Bonds Initiative taxonomy in some places. So for some activities, it simply refers to the Climate Bonds Initiative taxonomy. It also references the IFC's Blue Finance Guidelines and Climate Smart Agriculture project list. So it balances international and national regulations. And in particular, there was a focus on sustainable tourism because of its importance to the country. So the 4 objectives were climate change mitigation, adaptation, pollution prevention, and ecological conservation. They have 6 principles: substantial contribution, do no significant harm, respect for Sri Lanka's green development priorities. So they've incorporated that as a principle, science-based screening, and to be compatible with international standards and practices, and dynamic adjustment. And then you can see the sectors on the right-hand side. And just to give you a quick view of, this was the benchmarking that they did. So this is quite critical, is how do you want to align your taxonomy with other taxonomies? So they've aligned with the Common Ground taxonomy, the Sri Lanka updated national determined contributions, so they make sure that the activities actually contribute to the Paris alignment, the EU taxonomy, and the China Green Bond endorsed project catalog. And I think they've also looked at the Colombia Green Taxonomy draft, and as I mentioned, there were the IFC guidelines for blue finance and climate smart agriculture. And this is what their map of technical criteria looks like. This is an example of their sector activity description and then specific metrics. So they don't go into as much detail, for instance, as the EU does in terms of the underlying description of activities and technical criteria. So that's a lot of information. I hope it hasn't completely overwhelmed you. I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Louise. I don't see any question in the chat, but I want to see if there's any participant who wants to unmute and ask a question on what Louise just presented. And we will be sharing the slides from the speakers with everyone after the workshop. But if you have any specific questions for Louise, please do unmute yourself and ask. Or you can even post them in the chat and we can take it up later in this session. Okay. So maybe no questions right now, Louise, but thank you so much for presenting the entire toolkit and the roadmap for sustainable finance from SBFN. It was really, really informative. And I think there was something for everyone there. I think especially the section on what is in it for the companies and the FIs, and the what, how, and why of it is something which is a key takeaway for the banks who have joined us for this session. And also for the examples and, showcasing that there is progress in South Asia. While we don't have a taxonomy in India yet, there is a lot of progress which has happened in South Asia and Asia region. So thank you very much. Before we move to our next speaker, I just want to mention that we also, I also saw our SBFN Global Coordinator, Rong Zhang, join us today. So warm welcome, Rong, to you. Rong is also the lead for our ESG network and thought leadership at IFC, and also the global coordinator for SBFN, and she represents SBFN and IFC in several of our important meetings with regulators and even in G20, etc. Just wanted to mention that Rong is also on the workshop with us. With that, I will now invite our next speaker, and thank you to our collaborators, UNEP FI and AFD, for partnering with us and IBA to deliver a more comprehensive workshop and knowledge session for everyone, where we're bringing all the global knowledge to you. So I'll now invite Laura Canas da Costa. She's a senior global policy expert with UNEP FI to speak. Laura does not have a slide deck, and I think she has a little bit of an unstable network. So at some point you may see her camera going off. So please don't worry. She's still there. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Laura.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me fine, and the connection seems fine now, I hope. Yes, otherwise, let me know and I will turn off the video. Louise is a very tough act to follow. That was a very comprehensive overview, but I will take you to a very different part of the world to hopefully share some insights that are relevant, especially in light of initiatives and efforts to strengthen global alignment of taxonomies. Just a little bit of background about myself and the team. So my name is Laura Canas da Costa. As mentioned, I work for UNEP FI in our global policy team. You probably know UNEP FI is a partnership between the UN and the financial sector, with over 300 member banks. Our policy team was established last summer, in summer 2022, to provide support and vision for policy engagement across UNEP-FI, and is implemented in close collaboration with UNEP-FI industries, with our thematic teams, nature, climate, and others, and also our regional work stream. So I work very closely with Nirnita, our head of APAC. We prioritize banking regulation for now versus insurance and investment, which are industries that UNEP-FI also covers. And our global policy team has been engaging on taxonomy-related initiatives on a number of fronts. We are members of the EU platform on sustainable finance. The head of our team, Elodie Feller, is a co-rapporteur on the platform subgroup 5 on taxonomy, data, and usability. We're also observers to the IPSF, and of course closely follow their work stream on taxonomies and the common ground taxonomy that was mentioned just now. And we're also knowledge partner to the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group, which of course also has developed high-level guiding principles. So in this context, and in support of greater convergence of global taxonomy frameworks, I want to present to you today our work in leading the development of the Latin American Caribbean LAC Common Taxonomy Framework. So to give you a little bit of background, the LAC region has been classified as highly exposed, vulnerable, and strongly impacted by climate change by the 2022 IPCC reports. And the situation there is amplified and aggravated by inequality, poverty, and population growth. Sea level rise is also faster in this region than the global mean. At the same time, climate finance flows have been rather scarce in the LAC region, only about 6% of the global distribution, and has also been not equitable across countries in the regions. So I think, no surprise to this group, but taxonomies are considered as one of the important tools to promote a reliable and transparent market that allows more capital flows to move towards sustainable investment, and to increase climate finance in particular across this region. Taxonomies are being developed globally, as we just heard, very comprehensively, as you know, in South Asia as well, but also so in the LAC region. And the pace of development is rapid. There is a fear in general that a lack of comparability could create unnecessary hurdles for trade and international capital flows towards low carbon projects. At the moment, Colombia and Mexico are the only countries in LAC that have adopted their taxonomies. But there are 10 countries in the region that are currently in the process of developing their national taxonomies. Chile, Peru, Panama, Brazil, among them. So in this context, UNEP and UNEP-FI, and amongst others, this was an effort, a collaboration with MDBs and local institutions as well, set out in January of last year to develop a common taxonomy framework with support and financial support by the European Commission. And we developed a guidance document that will serve as a voluntary reference to orient different actors in the region that are in the process or intend to develop taxonomy. So the audience of this work is not primarily financial institutions themselves, but this is really taking one step back and developing overall principles and guidance for policymakers and regulators that are developing these taxonomies. But of course, ultimately relevant for the financial institutions that will be using these. So as a first step, this work really seeks to leverage existing taxonomies. So the first step of this work was to do a mapping of the landscape of regional and international sustainable finance taxonomy initiatives that are already in existence. And all of the ones that were mentioned in the previous presentation were part of this exercise. There's also, I'm happy to share the link to this work, of course. Then you can see what taxonomies were looked at specifically for this mapping. But there was a mapping done in terms of the objectives that these taxonomies cover, the different sector coverage, so really looking at the ISIC classifications and which of these are covered by the different taxonomies, and also which approach they take, whether they're based on principles, whether they have developed technical screening criteria, and so on. And this is all available. So in terms of so this is the governance. So commonalities and differences were teased out by this exercise, and finally, based on this analysis, the project provided recommendations for LAC jurisdictions, for financial regulators, Ministry of the Environment, for what to consider and what process to potentially follow when they develop their taxonomies. So I wanted to give you an overview of how this guidance works, or how the process that these recommendations follow. Overall, the project developed 6 overarching guiding principles that regulators should consider when developing taxonomies. I think these will not come as a big surprise to you. The first one is that while taxonomies must, of course, ensure contextualization to consider national goals and climate commitments, it's really important that taxonomies are comparable and interoperable with other taxonomies. And this is why I think this work will hopefully be relevant also for an Asia-Pacific audience. Because, of course, ultimately, these we hope to contribute to the global debate on alignment and interoperability. The second guiding principle is that taxonomies should have clear objectives and ambition, so that they contribute to a material positive contribution. So this is about having a necessary level of ambition. The third principle is that taxonomies must ensure clear, transparent, and robust definitions. So have science-based criteria and thresholds in how they define sectors and how they define the contribution to sustainability objectives. Fourthly, taxonomies must serve as a tool for credible transitions. So not just define the green, but really be a tool that seeks to support the real economy transition overall. Fifthly, I think this is something that Louise also spoke to quite a bit, is that taxonomy should be dynamic and subject to regular review. And related to that, the sixth principle is that taxonomies must ensure good governance, transparency, and the practical applicability. So there should be mechanisms and governance around when and how these taxonomies are reviewed over time. And that they're developed in a way that takes stakeholder views on board. In terms of the objectives, the LAC taxonomy framework guidance for now focuses on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation in terms of objectives. So for the moment, it does not look at other environmental and/or social objectives. A few taxonomies in the region, Mexico namely, does include social considerations as one of the objectives, but this overall regional guidance for now focuses on climate mitigation adaptation. And the do no significant harm includes ecosystem and biodiversity conservation, water management as well, but as I said, not as part of the objectives, but indirectly through the do no significant harm criteria. And then the guidance also includes social safeguards, as I think most of the other taxonomy frameworks in existence do, and of course the EU taxonomy as well. So decent work, quality of life, inclusive and sustainable communities and societies, sustainable cities, and gender equality as well. In terms of what sectors are included and not included, there was a quite a complex sector prioritization was carried out using parameters of contribution to GDP. So the first method for selecting sectors was by looking at their contribution to GDP, as well as contribution to GHG, so greenhouse gas emissions. And then there were different, in a cluster of sectors were selected basically using this method, different weighing, decision matrix, and weighted average methods. And also some attention was given to enabling sectors that improve the performance of other sectors. So through these methods, the project established a list of key economic sectors that that regulators should look at, and that's all in the report as well. Then another important element was that the project developed guidance for classifying and including economic activities. Again, this follows the logic that's widely been adopted by other taxonomy frameworks, but a distinction is made in terms of whether economic activities substantially contribute towards one of these taxonomy objectives, whether they enable other substantially contributing activities, whether they need to undergo transition, whether they do not have a significant contribution at all, and finally whether they are non-aligned. So there are roughly five categories of activities. So an extended traffic light system, so to speak. And then lastly, given this work is not about actually developing a taxonomy, but developing principles for a taxonomy, it of course did not develop technical screening criteria itself, but there's quite a substantive section as well on a kind of toolbox that regulators can use in selecting and setting technical screening criteria. So it provides guidance for the different kinds of metrics that could be potentially used across these sectors, and does not recommend specific metrics, but it's a kind of menu. So for example, for the transport sector, the paper lays out that regulators could choose technical screening criteria and thresholds either based on the eligibility of net zero technology in transport. They could base thresholds on different technologies' carbon intensity. They could define thresholds based on available alternative low carbon fuels, and then it goes through the different pros and cons of these selection methods. So it really takes regulators by their hand in terms of how to define these specific thresholds and criteria. So I think that is basically what I wanted to share with you today. Very happy to take questions. We also have a colleague based in Panama who's been leading this work, and I'm very happy to put anyone interested in touch. I will share a link to the report, and yes, so the report and this work launched just earlier last month on 10th of July. We're now working with various national jurisdictions, including Costa Rica and Panama, in actually taking this to then develop the national taxonomies. And we're also in the early stages, in the early scoping stages of thinking about a phase 2 for this work, and we will likely look at how to incorporate biodiversity and other environmental factors, I should say, into taxonomy guidance. So developing guidance, for example, for biodiversity as a next step. But yes, I hope the connection was fine, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Laura. The connection was absolutely perfect. So thank you for taking out time for this. Again, I don't have any questions on the chat, but I'm going to give it a couple of minutes to see if anyone online wants to unmute and ask any question. Okay, so we'll move to the next one. Thank you so much, Laura, once again. And thank you especially for highlighting the global discussion and the need for alignment on various taxonomies, which is definitely going to become extremely relevant as different countries and different geographies come with their taxonomies. And thank you for sharing the link to the report. We will also send this in an email to all the participants through IBA. And if there's any other reading material that you would like to share with the participants, please do share it with us. So thank you so much. With that and the fact that our speakers so far have been extremely efficient in terms of timekeeping, I think we will probably end a little bit before the expected time of closure for this session. I would now like to invite Lauren, who's the Senior Advisor and Taxonomy Task Force Coordinator with AFD, to talk about the EU taxonomy. I know that Louis did talk about it, but it would be good to see and hear a more deep dive on the EU taxonomy for Lauren. Over to you, Lauren.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay. Good. Let me share maybe a few slides with you. Can you see my screen now?
Could you put it on? Yeah, this is perfect. You're good.
You see it? Okay. Good. Okay, so good afternoon once again. So I'm Laurent Klein. I'm the AFD Group Task Force Coordinator for the implementation of EU taxonomy. So happy to be with you today. Just a few things that I want to discuss with you. And as you mentioned, I mean, Louise has already gave already a snapshot about the main objective and how the taxonomy works. So I'll try to go quick on this and build on what has already been said, and maybe give you as well, I mean, the way we look at it as AFD, as a development institution, having little operation in Europe, so directly concerned by the EU taxonomy, but the bulk of its operation outside of Europe. So the EU taxonomy, maybe just what we all need to have in mind is that the taxonomy is a key component of the EU Green Deal, and the underlying aim is to reach net zero emission by 2050. So that's the underlying objective on the whole system. We have an interim objective at EU level as well, is by 2030 to reduce emission by 55%. And it was 40 before, and we've increased that objective recently to 55%. Behind the implementation of the taxonomy, I mean, in terms of investment perspective and investment needed, that's very much significant. Few figures to illustrate that. If you take the two key sectors of it, energy and transport, that's over the current decade, from 2020 2030 in Europe, that's something around 400 billion euro of investment to move to the sustainable path only on the transport and energy sector. And that's an additional 130 billion euro over the same period for the other objective and activities that are defined within the EU taxonomy. Yeah. So Louise already went to that. Taxonomy, that's a classification system, a measuring tool, a transition tool as well. What's important to note is what the taxonomy is not. That's for EU, that's not a mandatory list to invest in. That's not a rating of greenness of companies. It doesn't make any judgment on financial performance of investment. And we also need to keep in mind that what is not green according to the taxonomy is not necessarily brown in terms you look at that type of investment. I try to move my slide. I'm not too sure if you're seeing it moving. Sorry, I'm locked. Not too sure why. Can you see slide 2?
No, we're still on slide 1.
You're still on slide 1. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay. It works now. One key thing of the EU taxonomy, one in terms of approach, is that EU has embedded the approach of double materiality. You probably know that if you look at the different taxonomies and models that are developed, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. There's the single materiality approach. That's the approach that is developed by the ISSB, yeah, the entity of the IFRS Foundation, that looks at financial materiality. I mean, obviously, financial materiality, I mean, the impact of the outside on your activities and the financial risk that it can bring to a company is obviously very key. The EU approach is going further than that, and we clearly think at EU level that that's very important to go further than the financial materiality, but to integrate as well, I mean, the impact materiality, meaning my activity as a company, how am I impacting people and the environment? So clearly the whole EU approach is based on double materiality, integrating financial materiality and impact materiality in my sustainability reporting, but further than my sustainability reporting, in my investment decision. Always look at the two when deciding on a specific investment. Sorry, I got an issue with my slides. So
would you like us to share it from here?
If you can, yeah, okay, it moves, but very much slowly. But
we can see slide 3. We're now on 4.
Okay, you got slide 3. Quickly, slide 3, and just to remind, it has already been said, EU for now, we have 6 environmental objectives, 2 climate objectives, obviously, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. And we've added, beginning of this year, I mean, EU added the circular economy objective, water and marine resources, management, pollution prevention and control, and biodiversity. So that's what is implemented right now in terms of environmental objective at EU level. It has been mentioned by one of the speakers. I mean, social taxonomy. I mean, social taxonomy has been discussed already at EU level, different working group, etc. But there's nothing in place right now, and discussion are still ongoing. Sorry. Okay. Sectors, the different sectors that are covered. I've talked previously about 2 key ones, transport and energy. But that means that the technical scientific criteria that have been defined at EU level for now have been defined on all that set of activities. So further than energy and transport, it covered building, manufacturing, ICT, forestry, services, water supply and sewerage, and disaster risk management. For all those activity and sub activities, you got very detailed technical criteria to qualify as a sustainable activity. Moving to next one. Oh, sorry, I'm. Can you were offering to push the slide for me? I don't know why, but it's.
Ashutosh, can you help with presenting from our end?
Sure. Is this visible?
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, taxonomy framework. So clearly, I mean, to be in a position to define if a specific activity is aligned according to the EU taxonomy, that's a few-step process. Obviously, first one is my activity eligible to my taxonomy? Is that listed in the different sectors that I mentioned before? So once your activity is eligible, there's a 3-step to be followed to confirm alignment. First one is make a positive, substantial contribution to one of the 6 environmental objectives. Then the next step is to make sure that in making that contribution, I'm not making a significant harm to the 5 other environmental objectives. That's the concept of do no significant harm that has been mentioned, the NSH. And third step is obviously make sure that I match minimum safeguards, knowing that they're safeguards, and that's mostly human rights, labor law, OECD and UN guidelines. So that's the way I can assess at the level of an activity if it is aligned to the EU taxonomy. Next slide, please. Okay. Maybe let's spend a bit of time on that, and because for the financial industry in Europe, I mean, in terms of sustainability reporting, and the way it works is that first that reporting is becoming compulsory for more and more entities. But as a bank, when you doing regulatory disclosure on your book, you have to publish different kind of ratios that have been mentioned briefly before. But there's one key ratio that everybody is looking at, is the green asset ratio, because we think that's going to be a market driver when you're going to go to market, issue bond to finance your own activities. That's going to be a key driver for investors. The way the green asset ratio is calculated, that's what you have on the left side of this slide. Grossly, you put at the numerator and using a bit of shortcuts, your loans, investments that are aligned to the taxonomy, meaning that's mostly EU asset. And that's almost only EU assets that are eligible, and the denominator of the ratio is your whole book. So for a development finance institution as IFD, where most of our activities is outside Europe, obviously that kind of ratio is going to be very low, the way it is structured. So the EU taxonomy offer you to report, to do one voluntary reporting, and to do one regulatory reporting, and to report as well on voluntary ratios. And on the voluntary ratios, you can integrate as soon as you can confirm that it matches both the technical criteria of the taxonomy as well as the do no significant harm criteria. You can integrate assets, loans, investment that are outside of the EU. The objective behind that is to be in a position to better reflect, I mean, the structure of your book and the sustainability, especially of your book. So, you know, I was mentioning where our regulatory green asset ratio would be by construction. Knowing that as AFD, I mean, we are in terms of activities, new commitment, we are fully aligned on the Paris Agreement, and 50% of our activities is climate finance, so bring climate co-benefit. So we just want to make sure, and we're busy working with the EU Commission, how can we better reflect that through the taxonomy disclosure. Once again, what we have in mind behind that, there's I would say two key things. One is external, is to make sure that we that the flow of financial resources is not going to be diverted to market that are in a position to be fully aligned with the taxonomy in terms of banking book. And second, more at the institution level, is to make sure that when I issue a bond on the market, more and more subscribers are going to look at your green asset ratio and are going to have to make investment decision based not only obviously, but based on your green asset ratio. So there's a whole questioning about access to resources and pricing of resources when I'm going to go to market. Next slide, please. Okay, maybe just two key platforms at the European level for the ones that like to dig a bit further. Two key platforms. The main one, that's the EU platform on sustainable finance. That's the platform that is advising EU on the usability of the taxonomy and make the necessary changes if need be. That's the group that has been proposing for approval of the Commission of the working on the technical screening criteria, what makes sense depending on the sector I'm involved in, and ultimate goal is to clearly monitor the capital flows and to increase the capital flows to sustainable investment. So that's the main EU platform for the implementation of the taxonomy. And there's another platform, which is the international platform on sustainable investment. That's a multilateral forum of dialogue between policymakers that are in charge of developing sustainable finance. That's clearly a forum, for exchange, dissemination of information to promote best practice, etc., etc. You have the list here of the countries that are currently member of the platform. Obviously, India is a member, and you've seen that based on the pool of members that we have within that platform right now at European level, we cover almost 60% of the world global emission, more than 50% of global GDP, and around half of the world population through their representation. So maybe just in a few words to conclude about, the objective of the taxonomy and the Green Deal, I would say, in general. First thing is that the objective is to raise the level of the non-financial reporting at the level of the financial reporting, in terms of comparability, traceability, audit, and that's something for a bank that is going to fall, or for a company under the responsibility of the audit committee, who up to now was looking only at financial reporting. Same work has to be done by the audit committee on the non-financial reporting. So clearly, that's one important objective. Second point is, adopting the double materiality for Europe is very key. And I've seen in the presentation just before that, several countries are also following that route of double materiality approach, financial materiality and impact materiality. Once again, essential. I've not talked, but it has been mentioned by the previous speakers. What EU is working on right now, now that the full taxonomy setup has been launched, is working on interoperability. I think that is key. We are all developing in our different geographies taxonomy. What are the mechanisms to reach interoperability between their different taxonomy? I think that is key. EU has got that in mind. The platform on sustainable finance, and that's ongoing work. I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for the deep dive on the EU taxonomy. Like for previous speakers, I'm going to open it up for any questions from our participants who have joined us. You'll have to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, this is Anand from Axis Bank. Thanks a lot for the presentation. It was quite deep and illuminating, especially regarding the EU taxonomy. So my question for you is essentially around a starting point. I mean, I'm sure the EU taxonomy has matured over time, and that's where it is today. Now, as Indian banks struggle together to come for a common taxonomy, we see a lot of institutional investors abroad trying to bring in their own thought processes in. So, when the EU taxonomy was being developed, how was this managed? How was this balance managed by, what is in national interest? What are international investors looking at? And how does one go across along this journey?
Yeah, totally. I think as you mentioned, I mean the process, the whole process of non-financial reporting at EU level has been launched in 2017. As AFD, as an institution, we are not subject right now. We may become, but we are not right now subject to regulatory reporting. But since the beginning, we've entered. We follow the move because we fully support it, and we've been doing voluntary disclosure. So just to illustrate that the process to make it work properly is that's a long pace. The way EU has been structuring the way EU has been structuring the move. In fact, there's two. I would say there's two key. There's different entities. You got high-level expert group at EU level that are where you got members of the different European states pushing their own things to the platforms. And when I was talking about two key body to make it work and make sure that you integrate the views of the views of investors, the view of the different industries that are going to be impacted, because once again, we need to remind that the first level of financial reporting is going to be at the company level, as a bank, at your client level, to do that reporting for the banks to integrate that reporting. So to make sure that we bring everybody around the table, the way EU has been working is first, the setup of the EU platform on sustainable finance. So at that level, you bring a group of different. You can have a look online on the website of the platform. You got the list of the members, but you bring experts, whether of capital market, that specific sectors, etc., to work on technical criteria. You have different type of, I would say, other type of people sitting at the platform level. You have observers. As observers, you have many. Our friends from UN mentioned that they are sitting at the platform level. You have a development bank, bilateral, multilateral development banks sitting at the platform level, just to make sure that we have a forum where criteria can be discussed and then pass to the EU, and then it moves to the EU system for approval. So that's the first key entity. There's a second one that is named EFRAG, EFRAG. That's an association that has been set up and promoted by EU to work on the disclosure format, on the format of reporting, of sustainability reporting. And the same way, EU mandate EFRAG, once again, a very broad group of the different people concerned by the implementation of the taxonomy, involved in the implementation of the taxonomy. EFRAG mandate is to work on reporting what we call ESRS. So that's EFRAG proposed to the Commission specific non-financial reporting template. So you've got cross-sector templates that have been developed, and you've got sector-specific templates. We've got the cross-sector ones. We are still expecting from EFRAG. I mean, that's work that is ongoing, the sector-specific templates. But EFRAG is working on that, making sure that we integrate very different views propose that to the Commission, and then it goes to the Commission process for approval. And just as an example, the EFRAG sustainability reporting, that's currently 1,000 data point of reporting that are in the different templates. One change that we got a few months ago is that each of that data points, that means that you're not going to have the 1,000 data point to comment on as a banking institution, but each data point is subject to a materiality analysis. As an institution, is that specific part of the reporting material for me or not? And you need to comment on. And if you're not commenting on that specific one, you need to explain why it is not material. Once again, I'm not. I'm speaking in the name of AFD. I'm not representing EU in our discussion today, but from what we see as a development finance institution, that's really the two key body that EU has put in place to help make it work. That's something that works for the different industry that are part of the process, for banking institution and for investors. And once again, on the two platforms, there's really a bulk of information that is available online. If you want to benchmark with your own proposal, etc., the outcomes of the platform work are systematically published. So there's really a significant amount of information that I think could be of interest for any country developing its own taxonomy.
Thanks, Lauren, for responding to Anand's question, and thank you, Anand.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. With that, I think we come to a closure for this workshop. I personally learned a lot, and I hope the bankers who've joined us today also have a lot of food for thought. And as the country moves on its own journey for getting up to a green taxonomy and preparing ourselves, we will be able to contribute a lot more. When we get drafts or or the final documents available to us. With that, I will hand over to Mr. Chandrasekhar, Senior Advisor with IBA, for his comments and to close the workshop.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Anjali. And it was a very informative session, actually. So we were really grappling with the problem of how to approach this entire question of recommendations on account of taxonomy from the banking side. Actually, that was the basic thing that was agitating us all the while. And when we spoke to IFC, actually, they readily agreed that they have the expertise that is required, actually, and they would like to come and share with this. And today we had a very fruitful session. I think my member banks will definitely appreciate the input that have been received. Okay. We now have a fair idea as to how we could go about actually in our endeavor in asking for what are things enablers that are required from the regulators, from the government in case of green taxonomy. And we also had another problem that how do we take the best of all the taxonomies available and incorporate in our taxonomy. That was another point that was agitating us. And thanks to Lara, it was a fantastic lesson as to how to map the various taxonomies and how to take the best of it. We had a very fair idea of how to do this. So thanks. And thanks to Lauren for actually enlightening us regarding the EU taxonomy. EU taxonomy is the beacon light actually for the entire world to adopt the taxonomies, being a pioneer in that field. So we could understand actually what are the bases actually and how to go about it in our taxonomy based upon the EU taxonomy model. Of course, we do agree that actually there are slight differences between countries actually, especially a country like India, which has got a lot of underdeveloped people who are aspiring for growth. We cannot totally look into the greening aspect alone, actually ignoring the social aspect of it. So all our efforts should be tempered with the realization that there is a very a huge social component that will be attracted actually when we talk about the taxonomy. So with that perspective, I thank the officers IFC and then Louis Gardner and Laura, Laurent,
and all my fellow bankers actually for joining us in this webinar. Actually, we have been immensely benefited, and we look forward to more such informative sessions with the cooperation of IFC and their colleagues. So thank you very much for this session, and with that, I think we'll conclude this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar. And before we close, just a quick request that we will be sending a very short feedback form to everyone. Will not take you more than 10 seconds to fill it up. It's very important for all of us, the 3 organizations that spoke to you today, to get this feedback. So please do take out time and fill that up. We will also share the presentations and links to the publication that have been shared here through IBA with all of you. So on behalf of IFC, SBFN, UNEP FI, AFD and EU, thank you so much for joining, and thank you IBA for giving us the opportunity and hosting the session.
Pleasure, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.